So there was an article in NPR that went viral, and I'll show you. It says one author's argument in defense of looting. And so people who are right-leaning definitely pounced on this and basically used it as, a prime example of like, see, the left are totally lawless. They believe in chaos and anarchy, and this is totally out of lockstep with mainstream America, and look at how insane these people are. That's effectively the point that was being made. Now, there's actually a really, really interesting and important philosophical and moral conversation to be had about the utility of looting, rioting, property violence, so on and so forth. So I want to dive into it and be as nuanced and thoughtful as possible and really try to represent a variety of different viewpoints on this. So first of all, let's make the obvious point. The obvious point is all of these instances of rioting and looting, they happen immediately after a well-publicized tragic event. So recently, of course, what it's been is shooting and killing by cops of unarmed black people, or just shooting of unarmed black people by cops. And you have these videos, these stories that go viral, and sometimes the facts are murky, sometimes not so much. But what happens is there's an outcry, there's outrage, and then there ends up being either rioting or looting or some mix thereof. In some instances, there's peaceful protests, but there always is some event that then leads to it. So, I mean, listen, Occam's razor in this situation, honestly, would be, okay, do you want rioting and looting to end? Stop killing unarmed black people. Now, that's not, an argument that you hear often these days. That's not something that people on the right will really accept. They'll say like, oh, you're taking agency away from the people who are doing these things, and that's, unfair. You shouldn't do that. They're responsible for their actions. But what I'm saying is simply, it's not a coincidence that rioting and looting happens after those instances. There's a direct correlation. And if you talk to these people, they will tell you this is why they're doing it. And there is a logic to it. Now, it's a perverse logic, and you could agree or disagree with it, but the logic is, hey, you broke the law, so we can too. If the cops are going to willy-nilly break the law and end people's lives, which is the ultimate way to break the law, the most immoral thing you could do, well then, okay, two could play that game, and we can break the law too. So go ahead, you keep breaking the law, and we'll keep breaking the law, and maybe you'll learn your lesson. So there is a logic to it, whether or not you agree with it. Now, Martin Luther King, of course, famously said, in a speech that was condemning riots, he said effectively that a riot is the language of the unheard. And, people who make peaceful change impossible make violent change inevitable, or something to that effect. So whether or not you agree with that is irrelevant. Whether or not you have an emotional reaction to all this is irrelevant. The fact of the matter is, there is always something that sparks it, and perhaps if you took away the spark, then that wouldn't happen. So that's point number one. Now, point number two is, Noam Chomsky actually had a brilliant take on this that's stuck with me ever since I first heard it. He was talking about, the logic of property violence to try to get a certain political ends. And he said, basically, in the overwhelming majority of circumstances, the property violence is unacceptable and you shouldn't do it. But he gives an example of one instance where he thinks it's actually perfectly reasonable to do it. He says, imagine you're an anti-war protester and you see a tank, you have access to a tank before it goes to Vietnam, where the tank is going to be involved in, killing innocent people. That's exactly what we were doing in Vietnam. And it doesn't have to be a tank, it could be anything. It could be an airplane, could be a shipment of guns that you know are going to be used to kill innocent people, whatever it is. He says, if somebody were to, break into the factory at night and destroy the thing that's going to be used for indiscriminate murder, and no innocent people get hurt in the process of you doing that, he says that would be an example of a perfectly moral, logical, reasonable instance of property damage, property violence. And in fact, he would say it's the right thing to do. So what he's establishing there is it's not as black and white and as simple as people make it out to be. Now, in some ways, I think it is. And again, I'll get to that in a little bit. But another example of, when is looting acceptable? Well, imagine you live in a country that doesn't have universal health care. I know, so hard to imagine. And your kid is sick and you can't afford the life-saving medicine. Would you break into the pharmacy and, take the medicine? Would you, in a stealth way, kind of befriend somebody who works at the pharmacy, maybe, find a way to get it where technically what you're doing is breaking the law because you're stealing medicine? If it's to save your dying kid, I don't think you'll find a single person, right wing or left wing, that would say, I wouldn't do that. I think everybody would do that. So that's an instance of, yes, you're taking something, you're breaking the law, but it's actually the moral thing to do. It's the right thing to do. It's the correct thing to do. Now, you could say to this point, Kyle, these are more broad philosophical arguments that it's not really rubber meets the road, what's happening in empirical reality. That's a fair point. But let's talk about those. So Hurricane Katrina, for example. After Hurricane Katrina, there was a bunch of looting that went on. Now, the media covered it, and famously, I think the reason why there was so much outrage around it is because the media seemed to care more about the looting than about the colossal death toll and the destruction. That in the wake of this natural disaster, when innocent people are being killed, it's like they're focusing on petty crime, and it shows how their moral compass prioritizes property more than it prioritizes the lives of poor people who were killed. So I think that's why people were upset by it. But I do think it's fair to make a distinction. Like, if somebody is stealing from a store some food to eat because they have no food to eat because they've been stuck on their roof for 2 days because of the hurricane, well, that person stealing food is only totally reasonable because they have to eat. But if it's somebody who's, trying to steal a big screen TV or something, then yeah, there's more of a moral judgment to be made there, where they're exploiting a tragedy for their own personal advantage in a way that's not built out of necessity. So I think that there's definitely a distinction and a discussion to be had there about the differences. So the utility of it is where the conversation gets really interesting. Putting aside the morality of rioting, looting, so on and so forth, the utility of it is interesting. So does it work? Does it bring about the change that people are trying to get? Well, South Africa, I think, is a really good example of this, because Nelson Mandela, when there were riots in the streets, Nelson Mandela was able to go to the white officials and say, hey, listen, man, you could deal with me or you could deal with them. And when the option is a guy who's super reasonable and then you have other people burning stuff down in the streets, that tends to make the officials go, okay, you got us, we'll work with you. It's like a good cop, bad cop scenario, and, everybody's going to pick the good cop, but in order for the good cop to be the good cop, there's an argument you need the bad cop. So in some ways it works. Now, there is a counter-argument, though, and I think the counter-argument is equally as persuasive. There was a study that came out about the civil rights movement, academic study, not too long ago, and they said that most change happened because Martin Luther King and everybody who was engaged in the civil rights movement, they were so committed to nonviolence as a matter of principle, they were pacifists, that when the cops started being aggressive against them, people saw how nonviolent they were, and your average American, moderate America, looked at that and said, oh my God, I'm really sympathetic to these people because they didn't even do anything wrong and they're getting attacked by dogs and having fire hoses turned on them. So as a direct result of them being almost overly peaceful, not even believing in self-defense, being pacifists, that made people flock to their cause, and then that's what led to the change. So in that instance, you didn't need a bad cop, you just had the good cop, and the good cop was so good that everybody sympathized with them, and then they ended up winning in the long term. So there are instances when this kind of stuff, even though you might argue it's immoral and unethical, it functions, it works, and then there's a counterexample which I think is equally as convincing. So that leads to my main conclusion. What do I think about it overall? I think it's a really interesting, nuanced, detailed, thoughtful conversation, but I also think, as a matter of principle, you should never become the devil that you're trying to avoid. So in other words, think about all these instances as, what if somebody who's my ideological enemy acted in the way that I'm acting right now? What if it's somebody who's on the far right? Somebody who's a fascist, who engaged in burning down a convenience store owned by an immigrant family? You know, how would the left react to that? The left would react to that and say, I mean, that's obvious violence. That's obviously illegal. That person should be arrested and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And so you can't look at tactics through an ideological lens. You have to look at tactics and evaluate those tactics on their own merit. On their own merit. And if an action is good or bad, it's good or bad whether you do it or whether your ideological opponent does it. So I think that you have to try to abide by your highest ideals and values and principles. And what that means is, yes, certain things should be off the table, certain things should be unacceptable. And I don't think that there's really an excuse for, you know, the burning down of these small businesses, the destruction of private property, of oftentimes it's immigrant owners. And so you can't say that in the name of whatever it might be, racial justice, we're going to do all these things which are bringing about more injustice, and in some instances, injustice towards, minority-owned businesses. Now, I get it that people say it's the same thing as the Katrina thing. People are mad that the media cares more about the property damage than about the lives that were lost at the hands of the state. I agree. That moral compass is out of whack and it needs to be adjusted for sure. But still, never overlook bad actions if they're bad actions and if they're ethically wrong and morally wrong. And so you don't bring about justice by creating more injustice. If you use authoritarian tactics for peaceful ends, maybe you're just an authoritarian because you believe in the authoritarian tactics. I'm really not a believer in ends justify the means kind of thinking, because you could effectively justify the worst evils of all in the process if you say, hey, if I get to this desired end goal, then it's worth it. Is it? But you did all these terrible things. What if I told you there's a way to get to that goal without violating your principles and your morals and your standards and your ethics? Wouldn't that be better? So I get it. There's definitely a point that we should focus more on the actual crimes at the hands of the state, and that takes priority over property damage, and we're over-focusing on the property damage to try to twist it so that, the left are the bad guys here. I get all that stuff, but I do also believe that we do have to try to hold ourselves to the highest possible standard. And also because I do fall more in line with the civil rights philosophy than the philosophy that worked in South Africa. I'd rather bring about the positive change and be on the moral high ground the entire time than have to play good cop, bad cop, and acknowledge terrible actions on the left. We can acknowledge that it's generally a bad thing. Rioting, looting is generally a bad thing. The only instances where I think you can discuss property damage in a way that's moral is really the example that, Chomsky gave, where it's like, okay, if you know that this thing is going to be used to kill somebody and nobody gets hurt in the process of you destroying it, okay, go right ahead. I do think that's a pretty clear example of it making sense. I do think if you're hungry and you need food to eat and you steal it, who's going to really blame you? Who's going to really blame you? If you need medicine for your sick, dying kid and you can't afford it, who's going to really blame you? There are pretty clear examples where almost everybody would acknowledge, like, yeah, that it makes sense then, but let's not work backwards from our conclusion and also, rationalize actions that are pretty indefensible, where somebody who had nothing to do with police officers murdering innocent people, you burn down their business or you steal from them if they had nothing to do with it. So you're just creating more victims. Granted, a different kind of victim, but you're just creating more victims and more injustice. And I think, from my perspective, I care enough about the morality, the ethics, and the principles to say we should bring about change in a way where we abide by our values the entire time, and we don't violate them in an attempt to win, because once you violate them, you're becoming the devil you're trying to avoid. You're becoming more like your enemy than you would like to admit. And nobody can say, I'm good because I'm me. And that's effectively what ends justify the means arguments come down to. It's that I mean well, I'm good because I'm me. And I think that really is kind of dumb. This was the argument of the Bush administration when they did torture. And the torture ended up being of innocent people a large percentage of the time. But in their mind, they thought, well, what do you mean? Yes, we killed Japanese soldiers who tortured our people in World War II, but we can do it because we're us. We mean well. So since my intentions are good, overlook the actual actions. No, you can't. The actions are everything. And if you torture, you're a torturer. So I think that we should try to be as consistent on this as possible, but I don't think that the media and I don't think that the dialogue around this is nearly as thoughtful as it should be. And unfortunately, people make it very easy for others to caricature you, strawman you, and act like you believe things that you don't believe. And I just hope that the IQ level of this discussion significantly goes up, because right now it feels like a pretty dumbed down conversation, and that doesn't do justice for the moment.